Welcome back with a smiling face. Important note before starting: if you are a fan of audio stories, then our Patreon account is the best platform for you. Join us on Patreon for the best audiobooks ever. Luna's Resurgence. Episode 11. Chapter 66-71. Nick POV. Samantha was more than horrified by Lucinda's appearance, stood and stared at her, tears welled up in her eyes, and she stood shaking her head as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing before her. Then, after a minute, she had pulled herself together and run about the suite, like a mother tending to her own child. Ordering Nick to go and get medical supplies from the Pack Hospital, wound dressings and normal saline to keep the wounds clean, things that she thought were necessary to be here in the suite for Lucinda's injuries. Had literally latched onto his arm and dragged him out of the suite, out into the alpha hallway, and demanded to know, in her words, what happened to her. Had suddenly turned into a mother hen, it seemed. Nick didn't recall her being like this with him, or Mary for that matter. But Lucinda was the Luna, he guessed, and she had been his mother's Omega, just fallen into her old role, he thought. Her distress over Lucinda's state was obvious, wanted to know what was going on. She had heard his pack-wide statement about Lucinda accidentally coming across a bear and it taking to her. But she did not believe it, staring at him knowing he was not telling the truth when he repeated to her what he'd told everyone. She had her hands on her hips, staring up at him with narrowed eyes, clear that she didn't believe it. He'd sighed, couldn't get anything past her, so he had used the mind link to have a private conversation and informed her of all that had gone on today between her and him. She had stood staring at him mortified for a full minute, then shook her head and prowled around in the hallway for another minute before turning to him with a heavy sigh. Stopped right in front of him, pointed a finger at him and told him he needed to be more tentative to his mate. Spend more time with her. Spoil her rotten and give her whatever she wants whenever she wanted it. Nick raised an eyebrow at her. Thought it was all very unnecessary. Lucinda was going to be fine, just needed to rest up. He also thought that if she wanted something, she would likely ask for it. He would get it for her, but she'd not once asked for anything materialistic from him. Figured she had everything she needed or wanted. Samantha spent a great deal of time in the kitchen cooking up a storm, ordered him more than once to go down to the pack house kitchen and get her ingredients for what she was cooking, that was not in his pantry. Lucinda kept giggling at him, especially when he tried to sit with her on the bed only to be called away by Samantha. Twice she'd barged into their bedroom and tapped her foot at him as if to say, "Why are you in here?" which was ridiculous. She was the one who'd just told him to spend more time with her. He'd given up arguing with the woman half an hour ago, and was now just letting her boss him around, like a mother would her own child. She was practically his mother anyway. And he knew she was just trying to look after Lucinda. He loved her for that. Didn't mean it wasn't an annoyance to him though. She brought food to Lucinda herself, and then sat and watched her eat it, made her some herbal tea, which Lucinda did not want to drink, preferred coffee, and was informed she would not be getting coffee this late at night. That the herbal tea was better for her and her injuries. Then stood over her and made her drink it, regardless that she didn't want it and clearly didn't like it. A mother hen to Lucinda, as much as she probably was her own children, and regardless of rank, stood there and made demands of Lucinda as much as Nick. When he had laughed at Lucinda, now being in Samantha's line of sight, Samantha had shot him a warning look, which pretty much told him she was not finished with him either. But he couldn't help it. Lucinda had thought it was funny when Samantha had been bossing him about and dishing out orders left, right and center. Now it seemed it was her turn, a little payback. She clearly wasn't used to being bossed around at all. It was funny watching her try and tell Samantha, no. Samantha just stood there and stared at her, like a mother. You may be a Luna, my dear, but you are injured and it is my job, as your Omega, to make sure you are looked after and eat the right foods and herbs to assist your wolf to heal you. When Lucinda had tried to protest with her about it, Samantha had folded her arms across her chest and stared her down, just like a mother would a naughty child. Lunas need looking after too. Not all Lunas understand this. Think that they are tough and can do everything on their own. Not going to happen on my watch. Then Samantha had pulled Nick clean off the bed, from where he had been sitting, next to Lucinda, and moved him out of her way, so she could kneel on the bed and stare right at Lucinda, from up close. Lucinda's eyes had widened. I'm not dumb or blind as others, my dear. Looked after a Luna before. I know one when I see one. I suggest you do as I say. I know what is best. There was dead silence between the two of them, as Nick watched on with full curiosity now, as a full-blown mother-daughter showdown was apparently going on between them. Who would win, he wondered. Watched as Lucinda's expression changed to one of shock, and then, to his complete surprise, she bowed out of the showdown, backing down from an Omega. Samantha nodded. Good, I'm glad you understand me. Now get some sleep. I will be back tomorrow to look after you and make your breakfast. Then she got up off the bed, pointed a finger right at Nick. No touching. He nodded to her. He wasn't going to. How could he? Lucinda was covered in wounds. He walked Samantha out of the suite. She turned and looked right at him, frowned at him for a full minute, then huffed at him. You haven't looked at her yet, have you? What? I look at her all the time. Get your mind out of the bedroom and look at your mate, she snapped at him and then walked off. I'll be back at sun up, she called over her shoulder. Nick frowned after her. He hadn't looked at her yet. He'd done nothing but watch her all day. He looked at her every morning while she slept. He looked at her a lot, actually, and today his mind had not once been on mating her. What was she on about? Woman was talking in circles or riddles. Why didn't she just say what she meant? She'd been very direct most of the night. Why not now? Nick walked back into their bedroom and stood and just looked at Lucinda. She was resting on a pile of pillows holding that cup of tea she hated, possibly not game to put it down. He didn't know what Samantha meant. What was she seeing that Nick was not? It was not the first time she had asked if he'd looked at her, either. What? She asked him. Nothing, just something Samantha said. What did she say? He detected a slight nervousness in her voice. Oh, so there was something he was missing. That I hadn't really looked at you. Oh, she smiled, though it was weak. Don't worry about it, she's just being silly. Nick did not think that, for Lucinda was now uncomfortable under his direct gaze. She didn't want him really looking at her. That was a curiosity in itself. Look at her as his mate, she was fine with. But not look at her, in any other regard. His curiosity was definitely piqued. His mind moved to the words Samantha had used when she'd actually made Lucinda submit to her. I know one, when I see one, referring to her being the Pax Luna. Technically, she wasn't yet, not until he marked and mated her, that was. Nick's eyes moved to Lucinda's neck, and he frowned. Samantha had once asked what Lucinda's previous mate's rank was. Nick didn't know. His eyes moved to hers and found she was watching him, looked more than a little nervous. We need to talk about this morning's event. Nick realized that he had been looking at her mark spot, and now she was nervous. Probably attribute that to her thinking he was going to try and mark her again. Okay, she nodded. I'm sorry. Rip and I lost control this morning, he acknowledged. She nodded. You're not going to try again, are you? Nick shook his head. No. I am going to abide by our agreement, and let it be your decision. You said that before. What happened, Nick? She asked him directly. Nick sighed heavily. Hard to explain it. I guess the only explanation is to say, the alpha in me wants to claim you and doesn't want to wait. She just nodded again, but didn't say anything. Rip and I will keep ourselves in check. We will not mark you against your will. I promise. You promise? She inquired, raising an eyebrow at him. Nick nodded and walked over to sit next to her on the bed. She turned to face him and surprisingly there was a small smile twitching on her lips. What? He inquired, but he did like that she was smiling at him. An alpha's word is worth its weight in gold, I hear. It was now Nick's turn to smile. Oh. Is it now? She nodded. You willing to back that statement up? Nick was really liking this, she was playing with him. What do you want? He offered, willing to keep it going. Your alpha's oath. She smiled right at him. That got his attention. She definitely hung out with Luna Linda way too much. You want me to swear an alpha's oath on it? Yep. That way, you actually can't even if you want to. You'll stop yourself. Now, where did you learn to be so devious, I wonder? Oh, he knew. Lucinda grinned up at him. Your new mother and father taught me a lot in the last 8 years. Last 8 years? Shouldn't she have known them her whole life? He thought absently. I'll agree to that if you give me something in return. Two could play this game. Oh. And what do you want? Tell me something about yourself, that I don't know. She was frowning up at him now. Like what? There isn't much to tell, that according to your board downstairs, you don't already know. What about your previous mate? He watched her turn away from him, a deep frown on her face. He sat and waited for a full minute, but nothing. Anything, Lucinda? He prompted her. His name, how long you were with him. How he died. It's not a hard question. To you, she murmured. Painful for me. All right, he knew it would be not your whole history, just something. Nick watched as she sighed heavily and looked across the room, stared at nothing in particular. It took a good 5 minutes before she said anything. His name was Matthew White, and he died defending the pack. He could hear her pain. You still love him? Her eyes moved to his. Yes. I probably always will. Somewhere deep down she nodded. He's been gone a long time, Nick. Nick nodded. He wasn't offended at all. He knew a couple of wolves who had second-chance mates. They loved their first mate as well as their new one. Room for both of them in their heart. But died defending the pack. That was what Lucinda had just said. It sounded like the truth. So why had Alpha Corey said he hadn't been there to see it? Curious. How long were you together? He prompted. Not long, in all honesty, she sighed. You don't have to tell me. I'm curious is all. I will tell you one day. Just get some rest. When you're ready, he nodded and then encouraged her to lay down and get some sleep. Hey, your oath? She suddenly asked. Nick chuckled. He'd thought she'd forgotten about that. All right. He cleared his throat and looked right down at her, felt Rip push forward, and then they were both looking down at her now. She smiled up at them both. He felt his heart beat faster. He would do anything to keep her. He knew Rip would too. He and Rip spoke together. I Alpha Nicholas Frost of Blue Moon Rising Pack. Will not mark you, Lucinda White, future Luna of the Blue Moon Rising Pack. Our mate, until you tell us to." He held out his hand to her and she took it. Nick watched as she gasped as an alpha oath band started to form around her wrist as well as his own. His oath was branding both of them, looked like a tattoo on her wrist and his. They were identical as he expected, the only difference would be the pack symbol on the inside of either of their wrists. He let go once it was completed. He'd had alpha oaths before. Treaties usually required them and the pain of breaking one was not to be laughed at. Not that he'd ever broken one, but he'd seen others break it. It caused immense pain to the party, breaking it. He'd seen it nearly kill one alpha, in fact. He would not go do that. "There you are, my dear, my solemn vow." Nick watched as she was staring at hers, touched it, and ran her fingers over it as she turned her wrist over, and there on the inside, to his dismay, was a small flower in a circle, which joined the line. He turned his over, he would have a moon, he knew, and it was correct. His hand snapped out and grabbed her wrist to look at her mark. She came from the half-moon pack, she too should have a moon, a half-moon. He looked down at the flower in the circle and frowned, looked right at her questioningly. Lucinda shrugged at him. "I've never had one before. Is that not normal?" Nick's frown deepened, he didn't know. "Maybe slightly different because you're the future Luna." He shook his head, not really understanding why it wasn't a half-moon. "Looks like a lotus flower." "My favorite flower," she blurted out. Nick smiled. "Really, I didn't know that." Made a mental note of it. He looked at her and she nodded to him. Nick thought maybe, it was odd. But then he had never given his alpha's oath to a woman before, it could be completely normal, appear different on them, he guessed. She technically was between packs right now. Not a member of the half-moon pack, but he hadn't marked or mated her yet either. He'd have to look into it. She was a pack member here, probably should have been the same as his. "Sleep," he suggested to her. 67. Lucinda POV. It was quite amusing watching Samantha, an Omega boss Nick, her alpha around, and to see him get up and do everything she told him to do. She was acting just like his mother, and to her surprise he acted like he was her son in return, wanting to please her, it seemed. She did see him start to get annoyed with it at some point. He probably wanted to put his alpha foot down on the Omega that was ordering him about left, right, and center. But he seemed to resist the urge. Saw him close his eyes and take a deep breath more than once. Glared at the ceiling twice and rubbed his hand over his face, in annoyance, she thought. Lucinda had been quite shocked by Samantha's reaction to her wounds and current state of being. The woman had spilled tears while looking at her, pain clear on her face at the state of her future Luna. Then she had pulled herself together and dashed them away, starting fussing about. Her need to take care of her future Luna kicking in. Many errands she'd sent Nick on. She'd come and looked at Lucinda a multitude of times while he was not in the suite. Like she was worried Lucinda was about to disappear or die maybe if she couldn't see her. Very motherly she was. It was very funny when Nick would come into the bedroom and sit on the bed next to her, only to have Samantha come into the room and tap her foot at him as if to say, "What are you doing in here?" and then demand that he go and do something else. Effectively removing him from the room and out of the bed. Lucinda had giggled the first time, trying to keep it inside, especially when he turned and looked at her. Then, every time it happened, she just couldn't help herself, it was too funny. She had no idea if Samantha actually needed Nick's help out there in the kitchen, considering Nick had told her he couldn't cook, and Samantha had effectively washed her hands of him in that department. So she doubted it. The woman seemed more than capable of doing anything that she wanted Nick to do for her. Probably was just trying to keep the man out of the bed. The looks she had been giving Nick, were definitely a mother's look of "Boy, what do you think you are doing?" It was almost as if he'd been a teenage boy, getting caught with a girl in his bedroom. It was very amusing to watch. Lucinda was brought soup for dinner and found herself under Samantha's watchful gaze the whole time she ate, didn't even pay attention to Nick, who was also eating. Made sure that Lucinda ate it all. Which she did. It was delicious, a chicken and vegetable soup. In fact, she requested a second bowl, which pleased Samantha. She even ate the buttered bread rolls that came with it as well. When she was handed a cup of herbal tea, Lucinda tried to tell Samantha that she didn't drink tea, and preferred to have coffee, trying to refuse the tea as politely as possibly. It was clear the woman had gone above and beyond for her, and Lucinda didn't want to offend her. The tables had been turned, and she was now the one being admonished by Samantha, who stood there staring down at her with a displeased look on her face and tapping her foot at Lucinda, seemingly annoyed that she was not doing as she was told. Samantha stood there staring down at her and practically lectured her about the need to drink the tea she had been provided. That it was freshly brewed by her, made with ingredients to help her heal quicker, all things that her wolf Kyra would need to assist in the healing process. It tasted absolutely terrible to Lucinda, it was bitter and nearly made her gag. But Samantha just stood there and stared at her, would not leave, it seemed, until she drank it. Nick was now finding it amusing that Samantha's attention was off of him and directed at Lucinda. He could now apparently see the funny side of it, like she had earlier. When Samantha announced herself as Lucinda's Omega, she was more than shocked. Knew that Lindy had her own personal Omega that attended to her directly, but other than that, had never really thought about it before. She'd never had one, but wasn't that something she got to choose for herself after getting to know the Omegas that worked here? At least she would think so. It was possible Nick could appoint her one. But it should be her choice. Lunas need looking after too. Not all Lunas understand this. Think they are tough and can do everything on their own. Not going to happen on my watch, she had announced. But it was the way she was staring right at Lucinda, as she spoke those words, the way she said the word, Lunas, that sent a shiver down her spine. Last time she'd been alone with Samantha, Lucinda had got the distinct impression that Samantha had picked up on her rank, and right now, the way she was speaking, she sounded like she was making a point. It hit home when Samantha pulled Nick off their bed and out of her way, kneeled on the bed right next to her and stared right into her eyes, very directly. That Lucinda fully understood that Samantha knew exactly what she had been before coming here to this pack. Her official rank even before Nick had scented her out. I'm not as dumb or blind as others. My dear, she had stated clearly, firmly, knowingly, looked after a Luna before she was informed. I know one, when I see one. She had not yet blinked at all, was making herself very clear. Letting Lucinda know, I know what you are. I suggest you do as I say. I know what is best. Oh yes, this woman definitely knew exactly what rank Lucinda was telling her in no uncertain terms, and all without letting Nick know, and the veiled threat at the end. I suggest you do as I say. That was her way of telling Lucinda, if she didn't comply, she would out her to Nick. They were just staring at each other. Samantha may be an Omega-ranked wolf. But she was also trusted by Nick, she'd raised him since he was 13, and Lucinda knew as well as Samantha did, he would not only listen to her but believe her. This was not a battle Lucinda could win, not with all her secrets. She backed down first and looked away. Good. I'm glad you understand me, she stated. Samantha, it seemed, did not expect to lose their little battle of wills. She knew Lucinda was not willing to out her past. Due to the fact that Nick knew nothing about it and she had been willing to bet on it, and had won. Lucinda effectively told Samantha, she was right, letting the woman win their battle and backing down, to keep her quiet, had told her she was right. That she, Lucinda, was in fact a Luna-ranked wolf before coming here to this pack. Now this woman had leverage on her, where Nick was concerned, could out her at any time. Though from her comments, Lucinda didn't think she would in any hurry. If Samantha had known this from the first time meeting her, and Lucinda was now certain that she had done, it was not something she was going to tell him, unless she had to. Apparently so far respecting Lucinda's choice not to tell him. If an Omega could pick it up so quickly, she wondered why Nick had not. He was an Alpha and should be able to detect such a thing. It was curious that he hadn't. The only other person in this pack that had really stared at her was Granny. That wolf was old and she had been beta ranked. Lucinda had picked up that much about her, had the same unique smell Jeremy had. Beta blood. It was likely she had also sniffed her out but not said anything. Lucinda didn't think Granny would say anything, that wolf didn't seem to like Nick all that much, and called him the Frost Boy. And had given Lucinda her cane to torment him with and beat him with when he needed it. Samantha had reminded Nick not to touch her and he'd just nodded and walked her out of the suite, though he had come back and just stood in the doorway and stared at her. Lucinda swallowed hard, when he'd looked at her, like was really looking at her. Wondered if Samantha had actually outed her to Nick. The way he was staring at her now seemed Samantha had said something to him for certain. What? She'd asked, praying to the goddess that she hadn't been outed. Nothing, just something Samantha said, he'd replied. Lucinda was feeling nervous now. Had she told him? What did she say? She needed to know. That I hadn't really looked at you. Oh, that was a relief to her. She'd not been outed. Don't worry about it, she's just being silly. She tried to brush it off. Saw Nick's eyes move to her mark spot, and had to resist the urge not to cover it with her hand. Had no idea what he was thinking, what had Samantha put in his head. He was definitely looking at her in a curious manner now. Really looking at her. Trying to see something other than his mate, and it was making her very nervous. To her surprise, he wanted to talk about that morning, apologized, and he'd explained to her his thoughts. It was as she'd expected, what she herself had thought this morning. There wasn't much she could say. He was an alpha wolf, and she had not yet allowed him to claim her yet. Not even made her for that matter. Though that might have happened this morning if he'd not tried to mark her. Probably would have, she thought. The words "I promise" gained her full attention. You promise? She'd asked. If he really did mean that, could she make him take it a step further? Actually protect herself from him, until she was ready. He'd nodded at her and walked over and sat down on the bed next to her. Okay, she thought, let's see if he is willing to go all the way. A smile twitched her mouth at the thought. Alphas often mad deals with one another while sorting out treaties and contracts, put their own lives on the line, so to speak. An alpha oath. When he'd asked her what she was thinking, she smiled. An alpha's word is worth its weight in gold, I hear. He'd smiled right back at her. He knew what she was thinking. Oh, is it now? Are you willing to back that up? She asked. Alpha Corey would be so proud of her, especially if she could get him to do it. She would definitely have to tell Lindy too. She would find it hilarious. What do you want? He'd asked her, seemed amused by the thought of it himself. Your alpha's oath, she told him in all seriousness. You want me to swear an alpha's oath on it? He didn't miss her meaning at all, and she knew it. Yep. That way, you actually can't even if you want to. You'll stop yourself, she nodded at him. A little assurance on her behalf. That way, if things did get like this morning again and they somehow found themselves naked and mating, that was all it was, for now. Now, where did you learn to be so devious, I wonder, though he still sounded mildly amused, not at all upset by her request. She couldn't help the grin that touched her face. Your new mother and father taught me a lot in the last 8 years. She couldn't help but tease him about Alpha Corey and Luna Lindy being his new mother and father. It was so funny. Where else would she have learned it? Corey and Lindy were both mischief makers. Especially with each other, but it couldn't help filter down into their pact though. I'll agree if you give me something. Oh, now that was interesting, because he could not ask her for marking or mating, so what else could he want? What do you want? Tell me something about yourself, that I don't know. Lucinda frowned. She recalled that board down in his office. It was clear he was more than curious about her and all her history, probably because Alpha Corey wouldn't tell him and neither had she. He thought she was from Half Moon Pack, and he had all her history from 8 years ago till now on it. There was only her history before that he didn't seem to know. So she told him as much. He then asked about her previous mate. Lucinda looked away. Talking about Matthew with him could start an argument. She had no idea what his thoughts on the subject were. It wasn't the first time he'd brought it up either. When he prompted her name, length of their bond, how he had died, and told her it wasn't that hard a question to answer. She didn't think that he could understand, it was actually hard. He was asking her to tell him about the first man she'd ever loved, bonded to, and discuss his death. A very painful day, that she had never forgotten, couldn't forget, likely never would, even when officially marked and mated by him, whenever that happened. To you, she'd murmured, painful to me, she'd tried to explain to him. All right. Not your whole history, just something. Lucinda sighed and stared at the blank wall across the room. She couldn't tell him everything, but this was what he wanted in order to get him to make her the deal she wanted. Lucinda was going to have to talk to him about it at some point. He'd told her earlier that he did not know Alpha Darwin, and that had been her major concern. He had told her it had taken him all week to find out that information on him, that was on the board in his office. He even told her he would show her all of it, if she promised not to go after him. It seemed he had concerns that she and Kyra would go after the man. Probably from seeing them that day. He seemed to just be sitting and waiting, not pushing her to talk, allowing her the time to gather her thoughts or find the words. Lucinda took a deep breath. She would start small. His name was Matthew White and he died defending the pack. Even she heard the pain in her own voice. It had been a long time since she had said his name out loud. You still love him, it was a statement, not a question. She did still love Matthew. Finding Nick as her second chance mate had come as a complete shock to her. Also, that she could have feelings for Nick and Matthew at the same time, surprised her. Her and Matthew's bond, though he was long gone, found that her and Nick's wasn't overriding it. Kind of fell next to it. She supposed was the only way to explain it. Might be different once marked and mated by Nick. She didn't know. Would she suddenly forget him and only feel Nick? That bothered her. She did not want to forget Matthew. Her eyes moved to Nick. She would not lie to him about it. Yes. I probably always will. Somewhere deep down she nodded. In all honesty, he's been gone a long time, Nick. She tried to reassure him a little. There was nothing more she could do about it. Wondered if all wolves with second chance mates felt this confused over having another mate. Wolves generally mated for life. Just once. She watched him. He didn't seem to be concerned about the way she spoke of Matthew, didn't get angry, that she said she still loved him. Perhaps he knew about it, or could understand, or maybe it just didn't bother him, he just accepted it for what it was. She had no idea. He had a very large pack. It was possible that he had wolves here that were second-chance mates. But again she didn't know. How long were you together? He pushed her a little. Not long. In all honesty. Lucinda couldn't help the sigh. 2 days was nothing really compared to others, but it only took a few minutes for her to want to be with him, the way he'd found her, claimed her, showed her off to his father. So proud to have her as his mate even though she had been wolfless at the time. You don't have to tell me, I'm curious, is all he reassured her. I will tell you, one day. Just, get some rest, he interrupted her, when you're ready, and then he was trying to get her to lay down to sleep. Hey! Your oath she'd nearly forgotten. He'd chuckled right down at her, it seemed was happy she had nearly forgotten. All right, he nodded and cleared his throat. She saw his blue eyes gain a red glow. Rip had pushed his way to the surface. It appeared they were going to do this together. Lucinda had never actually seen or heard this done before. But clearly he had done it before. She heard the gravelly voice as he and Rip talked together. Felt Kyra lift up her head and knew she was watching, that was her mate on the surface. Looking down at them, she did not push forward though. Lucinda could feel how tired she was from healing her. I Alpha Nicholas Frost of Blue Moon Rising Pack. Will not mark you Lucinda White, future Luna of the Blue Moon Rising Pack. Our mate, until you tell us to. He held out his hand to her, to take, and she took it. The minute his hand gripped hers she felt her wrist start to get really hot and then tingle. She gasped at the sensation. It didn't so much as hurt but felt really weird. She turned her eyes to her wrist and saw a black line start to appear and make its way around her wrist. It was his alpha oath mark. To show he had one with her. He was also getting one on his wrist. The sensation stopped about a minute later and he released her hand. The deal was done. He was now under his own oath not to mark her, until she requested it. It looked like a tattoo on her wrist. There you are, my dear. My solemn vow. Lucinda turned her wrist over and looked at it, felt it. It didn't feel any different to her normal skin. It didn't hurt either. Her eyes widened at the sight of a lotus flower on the inside of her wrist, the band joining on each side of it. It was small but detailed, quite clearly a lotus flower, and it was inside a circle. Looked exactly like her pack's symbol in fact. Lucinda found his hand around her wrist all of a sudden and he, too, was staring at it. She could see that he had a moon at the join of his. She thought it was his pack symbol and hers. Nick had no idea about her pack. This was not good. Lucinda had no idea that this would happen, that her pack symbol would be the binding mark on her. Probably wouldn't have risked it if she had known that it would happen. She was surprised that it wasn't Half Moon pack symbol, seeing as she had pledged her allegiance to Alpha Corey and his pack 8 years ago. Should have been his pack symbol then. Home. Kyra whined home. Lucinda agreed and suddenly missed it. Nick was looking at her questioningly. He knew what was supposed to happen. He'd been expecting the Half Moon pack seal and this was not it. I've never had one before, she shrugged, trying to play it off. Is that not normal? He was frowning deeply, thinking about it. Maybe slightly different because you're the future Luna. He shook his head, ran a thumb over it, looking down on it. Looks like a lotus flower. Odd. My favorite flower. Lucinda rushed out. It was the only thing she could say to cover up why her home pack's symbol was there. Hoped he believed her. He smiled and touched it again. Seemed to be happy with her statement really. I didn't know that. He looked right at her. Lucinda nodded up at him, he didn't look totally convinced, but seemed happy she'd told him what her favorite flower was. "Sleep," he commented. She watched as he went and changed and came back to their bed, bare-chested as always. Her eyes fell on his tattoo. "Is that Rip?" "Yes," he nodded as he climbed into the bed and lay down next to her. "I like it," she told him and reached out to touch it. "Sleep, I'm not allowed to touch you," he growled at her teasingly. Lucinda giggled. No, he was not allowed to touch. He was back to playing with her, it seemed. He was on her least injured side and she rolled over and curled into him. "Good night, Nicky," she snorted. He muttered and shook his head. "Turn the lights off." "Good night, Lucinda," he kissed the top of her head. 68. Nick POV Samantha was preparing breakfast in his suite, when Nick woke up. He could hear her moving about out there with his alpha hearing. The sun was not long up either and she'd told him she would be back at sun up. Had not announced herself, just walked on in and started working away. Nick had not heard the suite's door chime as it would normally do upon closing and locking. So it was probably broken by Kyra's explosive exit from the room yesterday. Nick's eyes moved to her. She was lying next to him, on her stomach, still sleeping. Her face was turned away from him, but her heartbeat was slow and steady, as was her breathing. He frowned as he realized a lot of the bruising that had been on her back was now gone. He had not been expecting that. It hadn't even been 24 hours yet. He pushed himself up into a sitting position and peeled one of the dressings on her back up slightly to check her actual wounds. They surely weren't healed already. It was still there, but looked to be healing nicely. Kyra was indeed healing her quickly. He replaced the dressing and slipped out of the bed, not wanting to wake her. Lucinda appeared to be healing at the rate he would, if not faster, than his alpha wolf's powers. Everything about his mate was odd, it seemed. His mind wandered to her injuries. She had not wanted pain relief, even though he knew they had to be extremely painful. 70% of her had been covered in bruises and claw marks. Yet it was like she just didn't feel it. Was more irritated by them when trying to get comfortable, than pained. She was also healing a lot faster than a normal wolf. He'd seen the occasional warrior with bear wounds from out on the North Patrol could take nearly a week to heal those wounds. She was lucky to be alive actually. Kyra was definitely not a normal wolf. Different in every way. He headed for the kitchen. Samantha looked over to him as he walked in, nodded to him and turned back to cooking. "Is she awake yet?" "No, still sleeping," he answered. "Samantha, what am I missing?" "I know she's different." "You obviously know what I am missing," he asked her. I do," she nodded but didn't look at him. "Perhaps, you should just go in there and ask her." "I have," he frowned. The girl would not talk about her past. "Not my place to tell Nick." "She will tell you when she is ready, I'm guessing," she informed him softly. Nick shook his head. "Why are women so darn annoying?" he mused aloud. That made Samantha laugh softly. "All mates like to annoy each other, Nick, it's part of playing with each other, a fun part for us females, drives you men nuts, and once you're marked and mated, you'll find many fun ways to get the information out of your mate." Nick could well imagine, from her tone, she was talking about all the fun things that goes along with it. "She has too many secrets. I'm sure she will tell you, when the time is right, for her. The girl has trust issues. Only where I am concerned." Nick huffed. "I don't think so. I guessed is all, and got it right. She hasn't told me anything, really. She'll open up to you at some point, just give it time." "She's been here a week now," Nick reminded her. "Not been a good week though," now has it?" She turned and looked right at him. Nick sighed, "No, I guess not." He walked over and made himself coffee and stood and watched Samantha put a plate of food in front of him. He nodded his thanks to her and sat down to eat. One good day and then one bad day it seemed. He needed a few consecutive good days. "So, Samantha." She was leaning on the counter drinking a cup of tea, looking right at him. "Announced yourself as Lucinda's Omega." He smiled right at her. She actually blushed a little in embarrassment, then turned away and appeared to be working on Lucinda's breakfast. "Well now Nicholas, who else are you going to trust here in your suite, with your mate?" Nick finished his breakfast with a small smile. She was right on that one. He got up and walked over to her, leaned down to her ear. "I think you miss having a Luna to look after," he chuckled. She snorted at him and shoved him away. "Go train, or work, or something." Nick laughed and hugged her. "Yes Mum." He walked away, leaving her and her embarrassment alone. But heard her chuckle to herself too. He only occasionally called her Mum. Mary did it all the time. She was pretty much their mother, since their real mother had passed away. Nick dressed and headed downstairs. It was still early and he had not been expecting to see all three of his unit in his office at that hour. Brady, yes, because he was going to have to deal with Valerie at some point, and Brady would be waiting for Nick to tell him to bring her to the office. They were all standing around the whiteboard looking at it. "Anything new?" Nick asked. "No, not really." Jeremy shook his head, "Too many gaps to be filled in." "You ready to deal with Valerie, boss?" Brady asked him right away. Nick sighed, "Not really." "What is that woman's problem?" His eyes moved to Brady. The man seemed to have a bone of his own, to pick with her. Brady just looked back at him, but said nothing at all. There was something there. Nick let it go for the moment. He could come back to it later, he supposed. Probably wasn't that important. If it was, Brady would just state it. Nick walked over to the board and erased the option he and Jeremy had put up there, wrote Matthew next to where it said Lucinda's first mate, and then wrote that he had died defending the pack as well. It did not escape Jeremy's attention that Nick was now sporting an Alpha Oaths mark. The man missed nothing, but then Nick wasn't trying to hide it either. He was just wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Training today was being run by the trainers. He was not required to attend this morning. He and the boys would train with the juniors in the afternoon today, run them through the obstacle course, and do basics for hand-to-hand, or Jeremy and the boys would. Nick would spend that time with Lucinda. She was his most pressing need. "Wow Nick! That's a nice wristband you got yourself there." His tone was full of amusement. "Lucinda has one now too." Nick smiled right at him. Then frowned. "Oh, on that note. She did not get Half Moon Pack's symbol, or ours. A flower, any thoughts?" They were all looking at him now. They all knew what was supposed to happen. The pack symbol, not some random image. Jeremy was frowning at him and shaking his head. Brady too. Kevin, however, tilted his head slightly to the left and his mouth quirked up slightly in one corner. "Kevin," everyone turned to look at him, when Nick questioned him. "I don't know, boss," he shrugged, and the quirk was gone in an instant. "If you know something I don't." "I don't. Just thought it was always the pack symbol that belonged to each of the pair completing the oath, is all." "Me too." He had a feeling Kevin was holding out on him. "I've never seen anything else appear." Nick nodded. "Perhaps because she's the Luna," Jeremy posed. "That's what I thought too. Seeing as she's not a Half Moon Pack member anymore, but I've yet to mark her. It is odd though. I have initiated her into this pack." So it should be a moon. The same as mine or her old pack's at least. Seeing as it was a forced bleeding, she may still feel like a member of her old pack deep down, and that could affect the symbol, I suppose. That is possible, I suppose. Jeremy nodded. I thought for a minute she was not a member of Half Moon Pack. But she definitely was, had that pack's particular scent attached to her, right? He asked Jeremy. He nodded yes, she did. Definitely a member of Half Moon Pack, though Nick could hear in his voice he was thinking about it. I don't know, it's odd. Nick sighed, very odd indeed. Kevin tapped the whiteboard, gaining Nick's attention. Tapped the information Nick had put on the board. Did she tell you about him? Yes, we had a bit of a chat. Nick looked down at his wrist. Took my oath to get it out of her, though. He shook his head. What was your oath, boss? Jeremy asked, and as his beta, it was something Nick would tell him anyway. It would all be documented today in his alpha oath cataloging system. Every oath he'd ever made went into it. Who he'd made it with, rank and pack, and the reason and the outcome. That I won't mark her, he stated. It was already in their mating alliance, so he'd had no issue doing it. Wasn't supposed to anyway. She had wanted a full guarantee that what happened yesterday wasn't going to happen again, and he wanted her to feel safe, so he had agreed. They were all back to staring at him again. Yes, we discussed that too. So are we on good terms now? Kevin asked. Better terms. Nick smiled. He liked that they were on better terms. Was going to do everything to keep it that way. Not allow her to pick a fight with him. And do his best not to pick one with her. Good, Kevin sighed, sounded relieved. Boss. You really need to deal with Valerie, Brady stated. There was a hard edge to his voice. And he, Jeremy and Kevin all turned to look at him, so it wasn't just Nick that thought something was off, so did Jeremy and Kevin, it seemed. Nick noted Brady's jaw was tight, but other than that he gave nothing away. All right, Brady, go and get her. Nick nodded and watched Brady, who turned and left the office right away. Nick turned to look at Jeremy and Kevin, a raised eyebrow, but they just both shrugged at his unspoken question. They didn't know what it was either, it seemed. Nick flipped the whiteboard over so only a blank board appeared there. 69. Nick POV. Brady returned shortly with Valerie. His hand was clamped firmly around the woman's upper arm. Nick could see that the man's knuckles were white, he had a grip on her, it seemed. Valerie looked angry as much as Brady did. Which was unusual, that man hardly got mad, didn't have it in him or not that Nick had ever seen, till the other day over Lucinda hearing pack members bad-mouthing him, that was. Now this. Interesting it was. The minute Valerie's eyes moved to Nick, her whole persona changed, her anger was gone in an instant and she smiled right at him, all sweet-like, just like in the hospital yesterday. He did not know what this she-wolf's agenda was, but he was not liking her attention on him at all, and neither was Rib, who was now up and prowling around with his ears flat against his head. Watched as Brady pushed her into a chair before his desk, and she straightened her clothing and ran her hands through her hair, trying to look her best for him. He supposed. She was smiling at him with affection and happiness. Nick sat back in his chair and just watched her, took in her actions and the way she was looking at him. It appeared she thought there was something between them. Well, there was not, and he would make sure she understood that by the end of this meeting. Why did you try and take the Luna's blood? He asked her, getting right down to the most pressing matter. He watched her smile falter, but only for a moment, and then it was back in place. She hadn't known he knew about that. Obviously. Oh. That, she waved a hand dismissively, just thought, you might like some on hand. Why on earth would I want that? He frowned now. Well, if she is going to play with the bears, she shrugged, a bit stupid she seems. Her tone was very uncaring and as dismissive as her hand had been a second ago. He leaned forward in his chair. Rip had let out a low growl in his mind, unhappy himself with her words. Do not ever call your Luna stupid, he snapped at her, showing his full displeasure with her and her statement. Future Luna, she stated right back. To his dismay, watched as she found herself yanked up and out of the chair by Brady, and forced to face him. Respect will be given, or I will put you back in the cells, he snarled at the woman, his anger for all to hear. Interesting response from his Delta. More a Jeremy thing, putting people in their place over respect, being the Beta. Or a Kevin thing, being the Gamma, and they were discussing the Luna. It's the truth. She is not the Luna yet, she snapped right back at Brady. Nick hasn't marked or mated her. She will be your Luna. You may refer to her as the Luna, Nick informed her curtly. He didn't like her comment, nor her calling him Nick for that matter. He would put an end to that, and quickly so. I will not. Not until she is the actual Luna, she said, and yanked herself out of Brady's grip. And you keep your paws off of me. I don't belong to you, she snarled up at him. No you don't. Thank the goddess. Brady snarled right back at her. What's going on? Jeremy asked Nick through the mind link. I do not know. Nick replied, and he did not. Sit down, Valerie. Nick grated out. He really didn't like her tone. Or her attitude for that matter. She turned away from Brady abruptly and sat herself down, took a long deep breath to calm herself, it appeared. Then she turned her eyes to him and smiled at him, returned to looking at him with that smile and affection from before. That implied there was some sort of relationship between the two of them. Rip was stalking around now. Punish her, he growled at Nick. Need to know what she is up to, Rip. Rip turned around in his mind, stalking in circles, peering at the woman several times, agitated. Nick, perhaps we could have a moment alone, she suggested. Her tone was all seductive. Why would I want that? With you, he shot at her, a little angry himself now. She blinked in shock at his words and his tone, looked a little bit taken aback. Because well, you know, she softened her voice and kind of looked at him a little shyly. Implying they were indeed in a relationship, and a close one at that. Deal with her. Rip snarled at him. We are nothing to each other, Valerie, he informed her instantly. She did have to be dealt with, it seemed. But she offered up, still using that sickeningly soft voice. It grated on his every nerve ending. That was over a year ago, and just twice. He clarified for her, in as a dismissive tone as he could get. Showing her she had meant nothing to him. She said nothing, sat there and looked at him, appeared to be hurt by his comment and dismissing their time together. He did not care at all. What do you have against the Luna? He asked outright. He wanted to know, to get this matter sorted out and rid of. Nothing, she said, and looked down at her hands in her lap. Nothing? Are you sure of that? Your behavior over the past few days does not say that. I'm not a threat to her, she told him. You won't want to be, Nick thought. His tone was harsh too. Your Luna is a bladed weapon specialist, he informed her, just to let her know that taking on Lucinda was a very bad idea. She will take your life, without thinking about it. If you present yourself as a threat to her. Nick didn't doubt it. He'd seen those dead rogues, arrows to the heart. He had now seen her reaction, to just the feeling of betrayal. If this woman put herself right in Lucinda and Kyra's path, he was now certain she wouldn't hesitate to deal with her. And I will let her deal with you, herself. If it comes down to it, am I making myself clear to you? Yes, Nick, she nodded, but didn't look at him. You will from now on show your respect at all times. You will call me Alpha, from this moment on, he informed her. Normally, he didn't mind if pack members called him Nick, when not in this office. Tried to have a good relationship with all his pack members, only invoking full authority when it was needed. Though most pack members did call him Alpha, out of respect, he did not actually demand it. As he was now doing of her. Valerie's eyes moved to his now, looked up at him, there were actual tears in them. Yes, Alpha. You are dismissed, Valerie, he stated, and waved his hand for her to get out of his office, out of his sight altogether. He watched her stand slowly, lower her eyes away from him, bow slightly to show her respect, and then walked out of his office. Brady, he noted, followed her all the way and closed the door with a bang behind him. Trouble, that one? Jeremy sighed. Agreed. Nick nodded. Even Rip wants a piece of her. What do you want to do about her? Jeremy asked, all beta now. Wait and watch. Though I think Brady is on that. Kevin cleared his throat. Perhaps there is more between Brady and Valerie than we understand. It appears actual hatred. That was what I got with my gamma ability anyway. Valerie hates him. I'd say it's mutual. Jeremy nodded. What do you make of the whole situation, Kevin? He stood for a full minute but then shook his head. I'm not sure, boss. Brady walked back into the office and stopped after closing the door, when he found himself under everyone's watchful gaze. Nick watched his eyes move around the room, from one to the other and then back to Nick. What? What? Indeed. Nick replied to him. Spill it, Brady. Nothing to spill anymore, he stated flatly. Any more, so there was something. Correct, he nodded. Then walked across the room as though they were done. I'll watch her and make sure she stays away from Lucinda. Nick wasn't about to let it go. Lucinda was safe in his suite for the moment. Any more? Spill it, Brady. I want to know. Nick's tone implied he was in alpha mode and not to be ignored. His Delta stood there and stared at him, then he glanced at both Jeremy and Kevin. Nick was not about to ask them to leave. Brady's jaw was set and he looked very unhappy. Like he was going to refuse, in answering the question. In fact, Nick would not be having that. Would Alpha order it out of him, if he had to? Then he turned to Nick and looked right at him. She was my mate. Rejected me right away. The day we found out, took her less than a minute to utter her formal rejection, he stated flatly. Nick's eyes widened in shock. He'd had no idea. He heard both Jeremy and Kevin gasp in shock. They had not known either, it seemed. Nick had had no idea at all, and he had betted the woman twice. Well, I'm sorry. I had no idea. It's fine, Nick. I told no one. We were both 18 at the time. It was a long time ago. Don't concern yourself with it, he sounded quite dismissive of it. Brady, if I had known. I would never have. Brady shrugged and waved a hand at Nick. Forget it, Nick. She's fked half the pack. Why not you too? He shrugged it off. Nick frowned. If he had known, he would never have gone near the she-wolf. Are you all right? Yes, Nick. It is what it is. Forget about it. Brady stated flatly, clearly didn't want to talk about it. Nick knew Brady occasionally had a girl her or there. He was not like Jeremy and his string of redheads, more like Nick himself, he guessed. Only took a she-wolf to bed when his urges got the better of him and he couldn't sort them out himself. Despite what Lucinda had heard, he had not bedded half the pack, only like 20, and some of them had been in his teenage years. He was not actually the man-horse she thought he was. He could have any she-wolf he wanted but mostly kept his bed empty. Didn't want any of them getting the wrong idea. Like Valerie. Brady had just let out a revelation and a half. He'd known Brady all his life, and to only hear this now, to know he'd told absolutely no one at all. It must have hurt to be rejected, and so darn quickly at that. It made Nick wonder if she'd changed her mind, when Nick had announced him as his Delta, or if perhaps Brady had approached her again after the announcement of him becoming a fully ranked member. An Alpha Unit ranked member at that. Couldn't get much higher. It was clear that Brady had some serious hatred for the woman, and she in return. It was possible that one of them had reapproached the other, regarding what had happened between them, and another rejection was given. That would certainly create the amount of animosity he was seeing between the two of them right now. "I am sorry, Brady," he acknowledged formally, as his alpha and as his friend. "Don't worry about it, Nick." Brady shrugged. "She and I would never have worked out anyway." Nick didn't know if he believed that. But if that was what it took for Brady to deal with his mate, a she-wolf he had to see all of the time, here in this pack, who'd rejected him instantly for whatever reason, he wouldn't judge the man. Or bring it up again. He was 29, it had been 11 years since the rejection. Brady had been dealing with it for a long time. Clearly knew how to handle it, had been in fact. Not once had Nick seen Brady have any animosity toward the she-wolf, until now, that was. The man hadn't even reacted to Nick bedding the woman, either. That was odd in itself. He must have felt something about it, but hadn't even so much as bat an eyelid as far as Nick could recall. It certainly hadn't affected his and Brady's relationship. They still got along, like they always had, before he'd bedded Valerie. Nick didn't know if he could be like that. Seriously doubted it. If Lucinda rejected him, he'd still likely kill any male that went near her, too possessive of her. Couldn't stand the thought of someone else touching her ever. Nope, it wouldn't go down well with him. Never let her go. Rip stated flatly. They would never be able to accept her leaving them. Nick shook his head, he didn't want to think about that. "Brady, what do you think Valerie is capable of?" Nick asked him. "I don't know, Nick, but from what I have seen this week, her behavior is different now. Definitely jealous of Lucinda. I would keep them apart." "Do you think she is a real threat?" "Maybe," he shook his head. "I'd like to say no. But he shrugged. "Watch her, Lucinda will be safe in my suite for a few days, while healing up." Brady nodded but said nothing. Nick got up on that note, wanted to lay eyes on his mate. He'd told Lucinda yesterday he would give her back her bow. It seemed like now was a good time to do it. If Valerie was going to be a threat of any kind, he wanted Lucinda to have all her weapons at her disposal. He retrieved it from the safe and took it to their suite. 70. Lucinda POV. Lucinda woke alone in the bed for the first time since arriving here in this pack. It actually felt a little weird not to have Nick's body right there next to hers. She sighed and shifted into a sitting position. Glanced down at her arms. Her bruising, it seemed, was mostly gone. She'd never had to be healed before. Kyra must always just do that before they shifted back. She shrugged, a good wolf she had. She was still aching everywhere, though it seemed. Reached out for Kyra, found her wolf lying in her mind, still feeling tired. Lifted her head inside of Lucinda's mind, yawned and then put her head back down. Sleep. Lucinda told her. Hungry? Kyra informed her. I'll go find food. Kyra closed her eyes and went right back to sleep. Lucinda got out of bed herself, yawned. The sun was well and truly up. She'd slept half the morning, it seemed, all the windows were open and there was a nice warm breeze blowing into the room, moving the curtains about. Went into the bathroom and stopped and stared at her body. She knew last night she had been black and blue pretty much all over, and had seen her arms were now not, when glancing at herself just a moment ago. But now, standing in front of the mirror, she saw all her bruising was gone. Kyra did indeed work fast. She peeled one of the dressings off her arm and the wounds were still there, just no bruising. Put the dressing back. Headed for the kitchen, stopped halfway to the bedroom door when she saw her bow case over by the French doors, where she had kept it before it had been locked away by Nick. She smiled. Nick had returned it while she'd been sleeping, just like he said he would. He'd kept his word. Lucinda found Samantha in the kitchen, standing drinking a cup of tea, leaning on the kitchen bench. There was an array of muffins on a tray on the kitchen bench. "What are you doing out of bed?" Samantha asked her. "Looking for food," Lucinda told her, reaching for a blueberry muffin. "We're hungry. I'll get you some breakfast now you're awake, my dear." "I can get it," Lucinda said, holding the muffin up to her after taking a bite, to show her she was more than capable of doing so herself. Saw Samantha narrow her eyes at her. "And I believe Dr. Emerson told you, you were to be on bed rest. Yet you are standing here in the kitchen." "I'm fine, look." Lucinda indicated to her body and the lack of bruising. "Your wounds are still there. Go back to bed now," Samantha told her in a firm tone. "I'm not tired." Lucinda frowned at her, starting to feel annoyed. "I'll call Nick and he'll come and put you in that bed, or you can go on your own." She was staring right at Lucinda, pointedly. Lucinda glared right back at her now. "Are you threatening me?" "Yes, dear. I am, with your mate," she answered, not looking away. "I wouldn't challenge me." Lucinda shot at her. "I will do what is needed to get you back into that bed. You can go willingly or," she did not finish her sentence, left it unsaid and raised an eyebrow at Lucinda, making her point. Lucinda had no idea how Samantha had the courage to stand there and argue with her, Omega to Luna. Either she had Nick's permission or she was so sure of herself and the knowledge she held about Lucinda, which she could tell Nick at any given time, that she felt safe in challenging her. "You do know. I have the right and authority to send you away, yes?" "Yes," she nodded, seeming unfazed at all, "but you also have a secret you don't want me to tell Nick." "Now don't you, Luna?" Lucinda's jaw tightened, so she was going to use the information she had, against her if necessary. "How did you know anyway?" "I was Nick's mother's Omega. I know what a Luna feels like. Not to mention how many Lunas this pack has had. Chosen or gifted. You all have a very distinct presence. Due to the Alpha's venom that flows through you." Lucinda frowned at her now. "My mate died a long time ago." "Yes. But his venom will always be in your blood, my dear. Now go back to bed please. I will bring you your breakfast." At least there was a please in there, Lucinda thought, and coffee she huffed, turned and returned to the bedroom, taking her muffin with her. She was not happy about Samantha having something to hold over her head. But what could she do about it? Nothing, right this minute, unless she wanted to tell Nick herself. She would get around to it. Just not right now. She looked around the room for her phone. Couldn't see it anywhere. Walked over to the side of her bed, where she had been when she had thrown it at the wall yesterday. Walked over and moved the curtains around. Nothing there, which meant it had been picked up and removed. Perhaps Samantha knew where it was. Lucinda walked over and got into the bed. She was not likely to get answers out of the woman unless she was in the bed, on bed rest, and Lucinda knew it. So she was just going to have to suck it up for the moment. She was brought a tray loaded with breakfast foods and, thankfully, a cup of steaming hot coffee as well. It was placed right across her lap. After breakfast, we'll clean and redress your wounds, so I can see just how you are healing up and report to Dr. Emerson. Lucinda sighed but said nothing, just nodded her head and started to eat her breakfast. Watched as Samantha walked over and sat in the high-backed chair to watch her eat her breakfast. Lucinda internally sighed, under supervision it seemed. You wouldn't happen to know where my phone is? Lucinda asked. Might as well have a conversation if the woman was going to watch her this closely. It wasn't like Lucinda was going to toss the food away. She was actually hungry and intended on eating everything on the tray. No, sorry, she shook her head. So where was it? Lucinda wondered. She'd been out all day and had no idea where it was or who had it. Though Nick didn't let anyone in here bar him and his unit, Samantha, and now her. So that limited the options as to where it could be. Likely with Nick or Jeremy maybe. She requested more food and it was given to her, and Samantha took up her seated position once more. Lucinda had the distinct feeling that asking her to leave the room wasn't going to go down so well. She hadn't been able to get her to not watch last night either. Nothing had changed since then, with the exception of Samantha letting her know she knew exactly what her rank was. She left once Lucinda ate everything and her wounds were cleaned and dressed, returned to the kitchen, it seemed. Pottered about cleaning and doing things. Lucinda found spending the day in bed staring at the blank walls very annoying. But every time she got up and out of bed, Samantha sent her right back. Though her wounds looked healthy and with no signs of infection, they were still there and not gone, and until they were gone completely she had to be on bed rest, and Samantha was making sure that Lucinda was adhering to Dr. Emerson's orders. Which were still in effect apparently. Nick strolled into the bedroom bringing with him some lunch on a tray. I hear you won't stay in bed. I'm bored, she practically whined at him. Nick chuckled softly. Well now, who ran off and attacked a bear? Lucinda pouted up at him, from the bed. Come on Nick, she stood up on the bed and turned around. Look at me, I'm fine. It doesn't even hurt. She saw him smile and slide his eyes over her. Realized she was practically putting on a show for him, and that he was thoroughly enjoying it too. She huffed, putting her hands on her hips. I'm bored, you don't even have a TV in here. Nothing. I know, he was still smiling. Bedrooms are for sleeping, and he grinned right at her. SX. Lucinda huffed. Naive, she did whine now. He laughed softly. Oh come on, it's not that bad. Have you never had to spend a day in bed before? Not doing nothing, she pouted. Oh, he was now smirking at her. That's good to hear, I can go all day my dear. Lucinda rolled her eyes. Is that all you can think about? While you're prancing around half naked? Yes, he nodded, still smiling at her. She was still only wearing her pajamas. Lucinda glared at him, turned and grabbed a pillow and threw it at him, not caring that he was still holding her lunch tray. He deflected it easily with those long arms of his, laughed right at her. You eat your lunch with me and you can spend the rest of the day on the lounge in front of the TV. How's that sound? Fine, she muttered and sat down. To eat the lunch he'd brought her, he sat next to her to eat as well. He was watching her quite intently. Did he think she wouldn't eat either? What? She asked, a little annoyed. You heal fast. Lucinda shrugged. Do I? As fast as I could. He suddenly leaned right over to her and she saw Rip right there with him, a red glow in his eyes, and they smelled her. Lucinda's eyes widened. What are you doing? She leaned back slightly. I don't know, trying to see if you have alpha blood, I guess. Lucinda snorted at him. I'm not an alpha, Nick. She thought that was funny, that he thought she was. You heal like one, he stated, leaning back from her but still looking at her. Kyra acts like one, has the temperament of one too, sometimes. We're not, I assure you, she told him truthfully. What is your wolf? He asked suddenly, shocking her a little. Lucinda frowned at him, not really understanding the question. I don't understand. What is my wolf? He was looking right at her. She's different, Lucinda. Longer fur, sharper claws, greater control over your human body than most wolves would have. Strong like an alpha female would be, and heals you really fast. What's your lineage, I guess I'm asking. As far as I know, both my parents were warrior ranked, normal wolves for a pack. Nick shook his head. I'll ask Alpha Corey to send your lineage over. I think perhaps not just warriors. Kyra is too different. Lucinda was staring at him now. Why would Alpha Corey have records of my family's history? She asked. All alphas keep records of family history, the bloodlines. Every child born is registered to their pack. So he'll be able to tell us. I'll call him later. Lucinda bit her lip. That wasn't going to go so well. She wasn't born into the Half Moon Pack. But asking him not to do that would only make him ask more questions and demand answers. So she left it alone. Alpha Corey would have to come up with a reason as to why he couldn't give Nick that information himself. Her parents hadn't told her she had any special bloodlines in their family, so as far as Lucinda knew, she was just a normal wolf. Just trained to be strong, trained to be able to fight, made sure she was capable of defending herself and her women and children. Kyra? She asked her wolf a moment later. Surely, if she wasn't a normal wolf she would know what she was. A Luna wolf. Kyra told her, it was always how she referred to herself. But this time Lucinda heard it, it didn't sound as though it was because Matthew had been an alpha, which meant she was a Luna. But it was more like she was referring to the word Luna, as in the moon itself. Hungry, eat more. Nick, Kyra is still hungry. He nodded, that's because she is still healing you. You need to eat more. He got up and left the room, came back with another tray of food just for her a few minutes later. Does Kyra know what kind of wolf she is? He asked her, sitting down again. Lucinda raised an eyebrow. She'd only just asked her that question herself, nodded. She says she's a Luna wolf. Nick frowned at her, but nodded okay. Maybe he didn't know what it meant either, seemed to let it go for now. Once she'd finished eating, he set her up on the lounge with pillows and blankets, told Samantha he was happy for her to spend the afternoon on the lounge, might solve the issue of her getting out of bed all the time. Lucinda rolled her eyes at him. Then he left, presumably to go back to his office. Probably to call Alpha Corey. Nick, have you seen my phone? She asked just after he left the room through the Mind Link. You smashed it yesterday. I'll get you a new one today. Thank you. You're welcome. Lucinda spent the rest of the day lying on the lounge watching the TV. Samantha produced several snacks and that goddess-awful tea and stood over her to make sure she drank it. Lucinda had told her it was too bitter and had been informed it was good for her and her wolf to help them heal. The woman was nothing short of a stickler. Used the doctor's orders to keep her on that lounge or the threat of having Nick come up here and put her back in the bed. And made certain she stayed put all afternoon. Had not left the suite once. Lucinda didn't dare try and wander out of the suite, only got up off the lounge to use the bathroom, knew that Samantha wouldn't hesitate to use the mind link to tell Nick, dob on her so to speak. Kevin appeared with her new phone and sank down next to her on the lounge, smiled at her, used the mind link to tell her I put that photo of Nick on your new phone. Lucinda grinned at him sweet. He'd laughed, all your numbers are in it and any photos you saved on your SIM card, but all others are gone sorry. My own fault she nodded. Lucinda always saved her photos, especially of the twins to the cloud, anyway, she would download them onto the new phone. I put Nick's number in and all of ours too. Oh, okay she nodded, thanks. Can't mind link your photos now, can I? He replied down the mind link. I guess not she nodded. It was weird, having a half real conversation and half mind linked conversation with him, but Lucinda guessed it was because Samantha was in the suite and Kevin didn't want her to know what they were talking about. Lucinda, may I see your Alpha Oath band please? He asked, his eyes moving to her wrist. Why? She asked, more than curious as to why he would want to. Curious is all. Nick said it was a flower. My favorite flower, she told him, it wasn't a lie. The lotus flower was her favorite. She held her wrist out to him, might look suspicious if she declined his request. He looked at it. She saw Samantha turn her eyes to it as well. It wasn't going to get past Samantha, that she was certain of. Lucinda wondered if she would know the actual symbol. She was old enough to, she supposed. She didn't say anything to Kevin. It's pretty, he said with a nod. Well, you rest up now. Looks like only 1 or 2 more days and you'll be up and about again. Kyra's healing ability is good and strong, just like her I see. Kevin, she suddenly felt a bit guilty, he'd been there and seen them yesterday. Don't mention it. Kyra is amazing. I was very surprised by her. Large and fierce. Just what this pack needs. Then he laughed and nudged her playfully. Just what Nick needs to help us harass him. Lucinda smiled at him. Thanks, I'll tell her, she's really tired at the moment. Sleeping a lot. Is that normal? She asked him. Kevin nodded, yes, and she'll probably sleep a whole day after you're all healed up too. Oh, okay, that was new to her too. Why don't you shop for things to go in your office, he suggested, tapping her phone. I've already hooked you up to the Wi-Fi. That might cure some of your boredom. He winked at her, then got up and left the room. Her attention turned to Samantha, who just looked at her curiously but said nothing about the mark on her wrist. She knew Samantha definitely knew it was a pack symbol. Belonged to her former mate due to the fact that she knew he was an alpha-blooded male. Didn't ask her any questions at all, and after a minute just went back to the book she was reading. 71. Nick POV. Nick spent the next 2 days catching up on pack duties, training his men and going over budgets, checking on the construction of the new school and of Lucinda's new office. It was now gutted and they were laying the flooring she had picked, a very plush, deep magenta, colored carpet. The woman, it seemed, was going to have a very girly office. She had shown him the white lounge and matching chairs she had picked out. Her desk was a soft grey wood with a matching grey material chair. She wanted the walls to be cream and she had picked 2-tone curtains that matched the carpet, were cream on top and darkened to a very deep pink hue at the bottom. Her bathroom was all white with a few green accent tiles down the shower wall. An open shower and a freestanding vanity. All simple and clean. His builders were all over it. It should be completed in a week, he'd been informed. Nick had picked the doors. wanting full security for her office as his was. Even the adjoining door would have a security feature. Not to protect her from him or his pack, but from any and everything else that could go wrong. He would protect her. She hadn't even argued about it. Just nodded and said it was a good idea. Surprising him more than a little. Lucinda, other than shopping for one afternoon and morning, was bored out of her mind apparently, complained about it, every time she laid eyes on him. Also complained about the horrible tea that Samantha made her drink after every meal. There wasn't much he could do about it. She was on bed rest. Her wounds had healed up enough to have her stitches and staples removed the day after returning to the suite, but were still there, healing over. He had insisted she stay on bed rest, until they were fully healed over. Seen for himself this morning that they were just faint lines. And halted her complaining right away. Telling her that the ones on her back still needed another day. Probably didn't, but he wanted to make sure. Lucinda had protested instantly, but he'd told her, it was for Kyra, not herself, and other than huffing in annoyance at him, she had agreed to it. Clearly wanting to take care of Kyra, after she'd healed her so quickly. She had no scars either. Nick was expecting one or two, some of those wounds had been very deep. He'd managed to keep his hands to himself, had woken up every morning with her curled into him or he around her. She had slept late each morning and he'd left her sleeping. She and Kyra needed the rest due to all the healing. And despite Lucinda's constant complaining of being bored, she was tired, napped on and off during the day. Samantha reported to him. He'd been happy to return to their suite. The door now replaced with a new one and working as before. Chimed every time it closed, showing it was locking into place. He'd had lunch with her every day and she seemed genuinely happy to see him, have meals with him, and they sat and chatted about nothing in particular. So bored it seemed, couldn't wait for him to come to the suite. It was cute. He liked the way she looked up and saw it was him, smiled right at him now. Made him think any future punishments should be house arrests, he smiled to himself. They'd not had an argument or even heated moment in 3 days, since her bloodlust episode, though Kyra was still missing in action. Might be a bit different when she returned. Alpha Corey had told him Kyra was a naturally grumpy and growly wolf. It was really nice that they could get along. It seemed she was actively allowing their bond to affect her and grow between them. Lucinda often pouted up at him, trying to get him to let her out of the room and off bed rest. But he was not going to do that, and had promised Emerson to keep her on bed rest. Besides, he liked knowing exactly where she was, that she was eager to see him on a daily basis. He could have worked from his office in their suite, but liked her missing him, didn't think he would get the same reaction from her, if he was with her all day long. So this was better. That and being in his office in his suite, he'd likely not get much work done, probably end up sitting with her or annoying her. They were even going to bed at the same time now. She didn't try to shove him away and had curled up to him, comfortable with him being next to her, it seemed. She had traced his tattoo with her fingers. Driving him nuts, wanting to touch her back, but he wasn't allowed to end, her knowing that, he found she was playing on it. Teasing him. Teased him just last night about it when he'd growled at her light touch. She was even taunting him and then reminding him he wasn't allowed to touch her, that he had to keep his hands to himself, giggled at one point last night and stated amused, "Oh, you poor baby," and though he loved her teasing him, he had just about had enough. Wanted to touch her back and, with her wounds 95% healed, had rolled over and on top of her, pinned her down, his whole body pressed against hers, his hands had not touched her, were next to her face. A loophole he'd found. Had to keep his hands to himself. so his hands had not touched her. Stared right down at her and growled playfully at her. "Oh look! My hands aren't touching you." Then he had smiled right at her and her shocked expression. "Taunt me some more, my dear, and you'll see just what I can do, without my hands touching you." His mouth had smashed down onto hers and he'd kissed her hard, but briefly, before getting off of her. Before he took it any further and wouldn't be able to stop himself. Lucinda had looked at him from under her long lashes, biting her lip, and had stopped teasing him right away. Seemingly understanding, he was at his threshold. Nick had patted his chest. "Now, come here. Rip wants to have Kyra close to him," he'd told her firmly, keeping all amusement out of his voice. But was actually having a bit of fun. She had actually moved across the bed and rested her head on his chest. Nick smiled to himself. He was winning her over a little more every day, it seemed. Rip was happy about Nick and Lucinda's newly found friendship and closeness, had purred for her when she had complied. Kyra had actually purred back at him. It was very cute. Not asleep, it seemed, he thought she might have been. Rip purring had been for Lucinda, but the minute he heard Kyra, his purring got louder, as did Kyra's. Nick wondered if the two of them were competing to see who could make the most noise at one point. Even Lucinda was giggling at them. "Little weirdos," she'd murmured softly. Indeed. Nick had agreed with her, smiling also. They had settled down after a few minutes and everyone had been allowed to get some sleep. Tomorrow, though, she will be allowed to leave the suite. He was going to bring her down here, show her the pack model and pack map. Had to trust her with the knowledge. She had told Alpha Corey she didn't want him to come and get her, meaning she was willing to stay. He was also going to give her Alpha Darwin's file, if she would tell him why she had antagonized the man. Nick was hopeful she would, but was not counting on it. Not just yet, even though they were getting along and she was bored in the suite. She'd not once brought up her past. He'd seen her looking a bit sad twice, and when asked her about it, she said she missed the twins. He'd believed her. She'd absently rubbed her chest when she'd said it, and actually allowed him to slide his arms around her and cuddle her for comfort. Brady had been keeping tabs on Valerie. That she-wolf, it seemed, had done nothing but train and attend her shifts at the pack hospital. Hadn't so much as come near the pack house, not even for meals. It appeared she'd been put in her place and was respecting all pack rules. It was a relief. Kevin was out of action for gamma duties. His mate had gone into heat yesterday afternoon. Nick had told him once again to give his mate a pup already. Jeremy was sitting on one of the comfortable lounges, stretched out all comfortable, reading books on wolves. Trying to find out what a Luna wolf was, nothing yet, it seemed. But he had a stack of about 24 books to go through, which he'd pulled from the library. All about wolf lineage, and different things that could come from interspecies breeding. Not all wolves are mated to other wolves. Anything that was a shifter could be their mate, even a regular human could become a mate. There were 2 pack members now in his pack mated to something other than a wolf. It didn't much bother Nick. As long as they were willing to swear their loyalty and allegiance, he was fine with it. There was currently one of his warriors, Philip, mated to a kitsune, Sabella. She was a lovely red fox when shifted, very pretty and drew a lot of attention with her coloring and multiple tails. She was a bit on the bitey side, not to be snuck up on ever. Jeremy had learned that the hard way. Startling, a kitsune brought out its teeth, human or fox, it didn't seem to matter. Sabella was tall and willowy with long dark red hair. Jeremy always watched her when she walked past. Though she was usually in the company of her mate Philip, his top warrior, who just smirked at Jeremy and poked his tongue out at him as if to say ha suck it. She was very pretty in human or kitsune form. And being a redhead, Jeremy was jealous of the man. Had asked Sabella if she had any sisters at one point. To which she'd laughed and informed him she had 4, in fact. But she was the only red one, knew of his fetish apparently, had laughed at his frown and wandered off with Philip, talking about wanting to go home and have some fun. Nick was curious about what their offspring would be like, but nothing in that department. The girl had been here 3 years now. Not in any rush to have pups, it seemed. The other odd pairing was a water nymph and a she-wolf. He was a good 15 years older than his mate too, been bonded and a part of this pack for nearly 20 years now. He was not something to mess with, had good control over any water that lay around, some magic in him and it was strong. Mylan was his name and his mate Faye lived out by the eastern lake. They had just one child, a girl, and she had yet to show any signs of or wolf a nymph. She'd be 18 soon if his memory served him correctly. Mylan had just shrugged it off, her not getting her shifter at 16. Stated it was likely she would be a nymph because of her demeanor. She was very naughty, as all nymph young were, quite mischievous and could be more than a handful at times. Mylan was overly protective of his daughter and his mate who had a small brown and white wolf. Actually, not even Alex or Liam had gone near Mylan and his family. Said a lot about the fear he could strike into even an alpha. Probably to do with the fact that if he wanted to drown you, he could do it without even touching you, a simple wave of his hand. Nick left them to themselves. It was what they wanted. Well, what Mylan preferred. They were peaceful pack members and lived in a small town on the eastern side of the lake, about 25 homes over there. Mylan liked to maintain the health of the lake and the waterways that fed it. Nick let him. Nick knew nymphs visited out that way, just let them, they were of no real threat, liked to keep to their own kind and the waterways. This pack also had a treaty with them due to Mylan's presence here in the pack. Faye was a school teacher. Once the new school was built, Faye would be able to work here on pack territory, instead of out in the human world. Mylan was more than happy about that, didn't like Faye leaving the pack or his daughter, for that matter. Nick racked his brain. He couldn't think of the girl's name, Phelan. That's right, a combination of both her parents' name, apparently a nymph tradition. Nick looked up from his work a few hours later when Jeremy announced he'd found it. Got up and walked over to see for himself. A Luna wolf, a direct descendant of the moon goddess Selena herself. Jeremy whistled, maybe not punished after all. Nick was more than shocked by this news. Upstairs in his suite was a direct descendant of the moon goddess herself. A blessing no one dared to ask for. Sweet goddess. It stated that a Luna wolf only appeared when they came across their goddess-gifted mate. So would appear wolfless until they met. Well, that explains why Kyra didn't appear until a few months ago. But it didn't explain how Lucinda had a mate before him. Luna wolves could appear in very young girls if their mate was around or they grew up in the same pack as their mate. Interesting, if Lucinda had grown up here, he wondered how young she would have been and would he have recognized her as his mate as she did him. He had no idea. Thought maybe. Luna wolves were always very large wolves, like the moon goddess herself had been. Strong and capable, with excellent healing abilities. There were several descriptions, most of them were however white, though this book recorded an all-black Luna wolf and an all-red Luna wolf. Nick heard Jeremy growl slightly, then chuckled at him, he was clearly thinking about the red one. Luna wolves didn't seem to have any special abilities. Just noted to be strong, aggressive, and extremely protective creatures with a fierceness unmatched by any other wolf. It did read that Luna wolves were usually mated to alpha wolves, that they would bring about great strength and vitality to a pack. When gifted to a pack, it was blessed by the goddess herself, and many pups would be born and quickly within the pack. That made him look at Jeremy, as Kevin's mate was now in heat. "Don't look at me, man, I'm careful." "Might want to be." Nick laughed softly. "Guess we can expect Kevin to become a daddy." Jeremy laughed. "Ah, that man bun of his is going to be all messy from his pup pulling it out." They both laughed for a moment before returning to the book. It read to his horror, most of them died young due to their fierceness and inability to know just how badly injured they were, didn't feel pain of injuries, so just kept fighting till they couldn't, and this is what would be the death of them. "Well, I guess that explains a lot." Nick sighed. He was not happy about the dying young thing. It did not impress him at all. "How young do you think young is?" he asked Jeremy. "I don't know, Nick, but that is why Kyra only appeared a few months ago." "Doesn't explain why Lucinda was mated to another first though." "Maybe Lucinda's mate is not Kyra's mate," Jeremy shrugged. Nick wanted to punch the man. It must have come across in his expression because Jeremy raised both hands. "Sorry boss, just thinking. Maybe that's why it's so difficult between the two of you. Or maybe you two were not going to meet at all. With you not wanting to attend mating balls and all. So the goddess gifted her to another as compensation for your lack of wanting to meet her." It could be, Nick supposed, who knew what the goddess's intentions were. "Got yourself a genuine granted goddess gift. By the goddess herself. Must have done something right then." Jeremy laughed. "Yeah, must be putting up with you all these years." Jeremy burst out laughing. "Must be." They both laughed at that for a while. "In all seriousness, Nick, I know, got to keep her safe. It seems they don't understand when they're in real danger of dying." "So, Darwin, it could be a real problem then," Jeremy sighed. "Still could be." Nick nodded. "You going to tell her about this?" "Yes," Nick nodded. "Maybe it will make the pair of them a bit more cautious. Counts for why she tears into rogues like they're nothing when on border patrol and doesn't appear fazed at all about attacking them or them her for that matter. Doesn't feel her injuries. That explains her and the bear, I guess. She just kept getting up and going it, like she wasn't injured at all. Likely going to be a problem, always." Jeremy nodded. "Agreed. And getting her and Kyra to stay here in the pack house and in her office, could be real hard. You might want to get a pup into her quick, boss." Jeremy teased him. "We'll stop her from shifting, I guess." Nick rubbed his hand over his face. "But I'm not allowed to ask for an heir either." "But that doesn't mean once you, mark and mate, you can't just pull her into your bed at every opportunity and, well, the goddess might just gift you a pup to help you out and keep her safe." Jeremy smirked at him. "Bit of a pickle," Nick admitted. "Yep, I for one, don't see Lucinda sitting around in an office all day." Jeremy nodded. "Unfortunately, neither do I," Nick sighed. At least now he knew what she was. And that he would have to protect her from herself, it seemed. That was going to go over well. The rest of the audiobook will be continued in the next episode. Join us on Patreon for early access or more great audiobooks. A link is provided in the video description.